Sorry, Cheryl. You may be seated. Join us in the prayer for illumination. Guide us, O Lord, by your word and spirit, that in your light we may see light, in your truth find wisdom, and in your will discover your peace. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So we've been traveling through the life of Joseph, and up until now it's been almost nothing but bad news for Joseph in an external sense. I mean, he is the favored son by his father. He's given this extravagant coat, and he has this prayer of dreams in which not only are his brothers bowing down to him and his fathers, but the way they're represented, it's almost as the whole universe is bowing down before Joseph. And Joseph, of course, being teenage and not so wise, feels the need to share these dreams with his brothers and his father. And he incites their jealousy. And from there, his life continually goes from sort of material discomfort to worse, to worse, to worse. He leaves his father's side one day to go to the fields, and his brothers throw him in a pit. From there, he's sold off as a slave and goes down to Egypt, where he lands in the house of a powerful Egyptian. But even there, after harassment and an attempted rape, he is taken out, falsely accused, and thrown into another pit, a prison this time. Joseph's story up until now is what we would consider probably in our culture a very unhappy one. It is a story of exile. It is a story of his family betraying him. It is a story of him becoming really a victim of human trafficking, if you think about it. Sold off, vulnerable, completely alone. He's in a country that he doesn't understand the language. He doesn't understand the economics. He has no power. He has no standing. His very existence is at the whim of people who are powerful and can toss him around. And yet that's what it looks like on the outside. On the inside, the story keeps telling us God is with Joseph every step of the way. And last week I challenged you by saying that what seems like such horrific circumstances is in fact a way that God is using what others intend for harm. He will tell us in the end. God intends for good. Joseph is going to be the end of Genesis. Throughout all of Genesis, we've seen these themes of human trafficking, of sexual abuse, of brother turning against brother. The human race seems incredibly dismal and meager. And yet God has promised through this one family that he will come and start to set right the world again. And Joseph is one of those people who will eventually, for a brief moment, set the world right again. And in my opinion, he could not have gone there if he was still wearing that extravagant coat and bragging about his dreams. There is something that he needed to learn, the posture of vulnerability. He needed to learn what it was like to go through the pit in order to be the sort of person that would eventually emerge worthy of being called a prince. I wonder, when Joseph was in prison, how many times he thought back to those dreams he had as a boy while he was in prison. For his whole adult life, right? For 10 years he's in prison, and then even after he's forgotten for 2 years more, did he think back to those dreams? And I wonder what he thought. I wonder if sometimes he thought back on those dreams and thought to himself, boy, those were wrong. Life didn't turn out anything like I thought it would from those dreams. Or I wonder if he thought back on those dreams and knew that they had indeed come from God and thought, I don't know how this is going to turn out, but in some way, that vision of the family being together, centered around Joseph, might come true. I don't know, but I bet you he thought about those dreams a lot of times while he is in exile in Egypt. And maybe that's the reason he responds so well to the dreams that he hears when he's in the prison. You know, he's in Egypt, in this prison, in a foreign culture, speaking of foreign tongues, surrounded by foreign people. And it's interesting how much of this section of his story is actually so Egyptian in its context. There's very little here that's in Hebrew. And in fact, as I went through the passage this week and began to translate it, I encountered words I had never heard before. And when I looked them up, I realized they're actually Egyptian words that are scattered throughout this context, particularly when it comes to the dreams. There's a lot of things that are just foreign to the way Hebrews or Jews understood themselves that's very Egyptian in this. And one of it is dreams. God does speak with dreams, sometimes with his chosen people, but if you notice in the Old Testament, and even in the New, if you think of Pilate's wife, dreams are a way that God often communicates with people outside the tribe. He communicates with them through their dreams. And this would have fit what ancient Egyptian culture thought about the way that gods communicated with people. Not just God, but of course in their world, gods communicated to people through dreams. In contrast to the way that we understand the dream, when I tell about a dream where I drove a car through a kitchen and crashed it, you probably are thinking, wow, there's something really weird going on inside Raleigh's mind. We think of dreams as arising from somewhere in our unconscious or something that we come up with ourselves. That's not the way Egyptians thought about dreams at all. They thought when you're sleeping, you're actually more in tune with what the gods wanted you to know. And your dreams came from outside of your head and were planted in them. The dreamer is, in a sense, passive for what the gods want to play inside their heads. And this was a major part of Egyptian culture. The dream was a threshold space where the boundaries between this world and the world beyond were quite thin. You can go to the museums of Europe and Africa and find dream books. This was very popular in Egyptian culture, where people would catalog their dreams sort of obsessively, write down their dreams first thing in the morning. People with vivid dreams were thought to be particularly blessed. And in fact, you can even in the British Museum find a book which is an advice book about how to incubate dreams better for yourself. Wouldn't you like to be a better dreamer? This is a way that they thought they would know more about what the other world had to say. In ancient Egypt, you could buy mattresses that were said to give you special dreams. They were supposedly, they think, uncomfortable. Maybe that helps you dream more. I don't know. You could eat certain foods that were spicy that would give you vivid dreams. In fact, people would often pay to sleep in temples and in pyramids in order to be closer to the gods when they slept, under the theory that somehow being geographically proximal to God would make sure that he paid attention to your dreams more. The interpretation of dreams, that was also a thriving business. There were people whose entire job, they were called oracles or magicians. They were highly paid and sought after to interpret the dreams from the gods so that people could know their future and they could learn to plan. Now, in the Old Testament, we don't see God, our God, the Lord, behaving in this way very often, but I find it very interesting that when he wants to intervene in a foreign culture, he does it in a way that that culture would understand. And it makes this story of Joseph perhaps a little bit more interesting as well. So I wonder if Joseph is sitting there in prison, thinking back on his dreams, how that felt for him. And I wonder if this is why, when people come to him with dreams, he feels qualified in a way, because he knows the Lord, to interpret their dreams for them in a way that they would recognize that Joseph does indeed know God. Joseph is, in their culture, the best oracle that's ever been. And that means that he knows something about God that they don't know. So one day Joseph is in prison, and two individuals are assigned to his care that have also been brought low. They come from Pharaoh's house. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, the ruler, the person who is the intermediary between humans and gods. In fact, often viewed as half divine himself. If anyone is in touch with the gods, it is Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's main job is to offer the necessary prayers and sacrifices so that the world is in order and the land is in harmony, and it will produce food and peace for the humans. Pharaoh is the sort of center point between gods and humans. He's also the center point of a lot of political intrigue and family jealousy. It's a tough job staying alive when you're Pharaoh. You must be kept safe at all costs. And we probably don't think of a baker and a cupbearer as people that would be essential to that, but they are. These two prisoners who fall under Joseph's care are two people who have a crucial role to play in the security of the Pharaoh. They're in charge, after all, of what Pharaoh eats and what Pharaoh drinks. And if you look at the history of assassinations and deaths in ancient Egypt, poison is the number one way that people try to get away with murdering or offing a pharaoh. So you can think of this baker and a cupbearer as, in some sense, a baker and a cupbearer, but also in some way you can think of them like the secret service of ancient Egypt. They're in charge of keeping Pharaoh alive. And one day when Joseph shows up to work, these two men seem particularly distracted. Here's what it says in Genesis and the Word in the book that we love. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" They answered, "We both had dreams, but there is no one to interpret them." Now you can understand what they're saying there is that God is trying to tell us something, and we don't know what it is. And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream, I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." "This is what it means," Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a pit." When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, "I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread, and in the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds kept eating them out of the basket on my head." "This is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away all your flesh." There's an interpretation. I always think it's interesting that the baker says, when Joseph gave a really good interpretation for the first dream, then he told his dream, doesn't say what his response is to hearing that news. But regardless, both dreams come true. 3 days later, Pharaoh has a birthday party, and he decides the fate of these 2 men in exactly the way that the dreams foretold. But when the cupbearer gets back to Pharaoh, of course, he forgets him. He forgets his promise. It's interesting here, that same phrase that the cupbearer forgot Joseph is the same phrase that Exodus opens up with when it says, "A new Pharaoh comes to power to whom he forgot," or Joseph meant nothing. He forgot what Joseph had done in the land. Forgetfulness, which, by the way, in the Old Testament, anytime someone forgets, it's usually the beginning of something really horrible happening. And that the core of faith is, in some sense, memory of what God has done. Anyway, one day, the cupbearer remembers because Pharaoh has 2 dreams. And the usual cadre of oracles and sycophants can't interpret it to his liking. So the cupbearer finally remembers Joseph, who is brought back into the palace. The Bible records that he is shaved. By the way, this probably doesn't mean the beard, right? But it's Egypt. Probably shaved his head, we're guessing. So he was presentable to Pharaoh and clothed. Notice that he gets a robe back. This is very symbolic that he's given new clothes. And Pharaoh says to Joseph this, as it says once again in the book that we love. "I had a dream and no one could interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." "I cannot do it," Joseph replied to Pharaoh, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer that he wants." Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "In my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile, when out of the river there came up 7 cows, fat and sleek, and they grazed among the reeds. And after them 7 other cows came up, scrawny and very ugly and lean. I had never seen such ugly cows in all the land of Egypt. The lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came first. But even after they ate them, no one could tell that they had done so. They looked just as ugly as before. And then I woke up. And in my other dream, I saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, growing on a single stalk. And after them 7 other heads sprouted, withered and thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 good heads. And I told this to the magicians, but none of them can explain it to me." Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do." This is Pharaoh's understanding of what a dream is, right? "The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. And the 7 lean, ugly cows that come up afterwards are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh, God has shown Pharaoh what he is going to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. And then, here's the same phrase, all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. And the reason this dream was given to Pharaoh in two forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. To me, this exchange between the slave, fresh out of prison, freshly shaved and given new clothes, and the king, who is half divine, is fascinating. I mean, here is Pharaoh, the link between God and humans. In the language of that culture, he is the image of God on earth. He is supposed to be in control. He is supposed to have the knowledge. He is supposed to be the one who is close to God. And furthermore, on him rests the responsibility of appeasing the gods and to provide the food and the order that his people need. That is his purpose in life. And he cannot even get an interpretation of his dreams that satisfy him. And these dreams are obviously about the things that Pharaoh is responsible for. These cows, grain, all symbols for food, right? And on the other side of this conversation is Joseph. Joseph, who according to the Hebrew Scriptures is also an image bearer of God on earth, just as we are all bearers of image, God's image on earth, who carries a generational promise from God to redeem Israel and to call them into another Eden, and who knows that the Lord is with him. Do you notice how unafraid Joseph seems to be here, even as he gives him a vision, an interpretation that flies directly at the heart of Pharaoh's status? First of all, he insists that he knows the God who can interpret dreams, and that he, as slave, has access to knowledge that the Pharaoh doesn't have. And secondly, that Pharaoh's ability to provide for the people is about to come to an end. There's a hint here, right, that Joseph's God is the one that truly determines whether the harvest will come, not Pharaoh's. He knows that a famine is coming, a famine beyond Pharaoh's control. And immediately Joseph, this is a really good sales pitch, goes beyond an interpretation of the dream right into planning before Pharaoh can even say anything. He comes up with a threefold plan to buttress Egypt against the effects of the famine. And that's to appoint a vizier, right? To appoint someone to represent the king throughout all of Egypt. You might think of this as like the famine czar, if we're going to use our own language, right? Like someone who's just in charge of this. And secondly, to appoint local overseers. And third, to institute a sort of national rationing program where we will save up food for the 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh loves this. Pharaoh notes, which is interesting, that he sees, quote, the Spirit of God on Joseph. And rather than seeing a rival to his power, he sees in Joseph a resource. There's a humility here in this Pharaoh, which is noticeably lacking from the next Pharaoh that we'll see in Egypt, where he can see the power that Joseph has and decides to use it for his own kingdom. And the imagery that results from this, when Pharaoh elevates Joseph, is fascinating. Once again, all this language of Egyptian culture, the new linen clothes, perhaps fancier than the coat he had as a child, I don't know. But once again, he is clothed in extravagant clothes. He is given a gold chain around the neck. It had nothing to do with hip-hop, I'm sorry, but I don't know if you can picture an Egyptian in your mouth. They often wore these gold chains, and on this chain here was the name of your Lord and Master who you served. Amen. It's actually from Proverbs. I don't know if any of you remember in Proverbs, there's a lot of language about wisdom hanging a gold chain around your neck. It's kind of interesting. This is the same imagery that you're having the name of your Lord, Pharaoh, around your neck. In the language of that culture, in fact, what's happening here is that Joseph is becoming an image bearer to Pharaoh, so that wherever he goes throughout the kingdom, people know from the chariots, from the clothes, from the gold chain, that he is in fact speaking for Pharaoh. It's the same language that's used in Genesis 1 to describe us and our purpose to be an image bearer for God, so that wherever we go throughout this world, We are the ones who speak and sound and act for God. People know God through us. In the same way, in this culture, that people are going to know Pharaoh through Joseph. And Joseph finds a home in this new land. He finds a family. He is given an Egyptian name. He marries an Egyptian woman. He has 2 children. And I think it's interesting that although he has taken an Egyptian name and married an Egyptian woman, his 2 children are given Hebrew names. And they're words that speak in Hebrew to the blessing that Joseph feels on this, the other side of his long, painful life. Ephraim means God has made me fruitful. God has blessed me. And Manasseh, that word nasa is that word for forget that we've seen already in this passage. God has forgotten my debts. God has forgotten the things I did when I was younger. Those 2 things in combination are what Joseph names his children. God has forgotten my debts, and God has made me fruitful. Joseph has entered into a new stage of life in which he is once again the prince that he dreamed about when he was a young boy. In essence, what he's doing, in a sense, and I think it's with the language here, he is making Egypt into a temporary miniature Eden during a time of famine, where things are right and orderly and abundant. But as we look ahead, of course, there's one thing missing from this Eden, from this Egypt that is prosperous in a time of famine, and that is his family, which eventually will hear of this abundance in Egypt, and while suffering famine themselves will return, leaving the dramatic question alive for next week. What will Joseph do now that he has established a new life, a new authority, a new family in a new land, when his old family, his brothers, and his father return to him? We will talk about that next week. Please join me in prayer. Father, we trust you with our lives because you are faithful and you are love. Even when we are in our pit, even when our dreams that we once had with you seem so out of reach, help us to hold true to the faith and the promises that you have given us, so that you too may be responsible when we are once again elevated, when we are made fruitful, when our debts have been forgotten. Help us to know that you are the Lord of our story. And upon looking back on it one day, it will begin to make sense. Even what others intend for evil, you can intend for the good. In your name we pray. Amen.